in some cases, people could literally be getting away with murder. We know the population and the development serves is exceptionally vulnerable to abuse, whether in facilities or in the community, and we appreciate that these abuse cases are often difficult to investigate, solve, and prosecute. We will hear more about that from one of our speakers. The answers may not be as clear-cut as we like, but it is critical that the state protect folks with developmental disabilities from harm. If abuse does happen, we must have a skilled police force that will ensure cases are investigated and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And our first panel will include an independent consultant hired by DDS to examine officers' investigative practices and make recommendations for improvements. The consultant will discuss findings to be included in a draft report coming out in a few weeks. Disability Rights California will also share their findings from reviewing the handling of a dozen cases. Well, what we will hear today will help inform us about our response to these issues, and I anticipate legislation will be introduced to protect our vulnerable disabled population. It is really of great concern that we have these hearings to make sure that the people that the state has been charged to take care of are really properly cared for. So with that, the first hearing, and I would invite Rick Zaharia and Kathleen Billingsley to come join us at the table here. My Senate co-conspirators will eventually show up. So, but in order to be respectful of everyone's time, I decided to get started. So with that, Rick, you're Vice President of the Consortium on Innovative Practices and hired by DSS, right? Correct. And then Kathleen, you're Chief Deputy of Policy and Procedures for the Department of Public Health. So why don't we start with Rick and then hear both of you, and then at the end ask questions. Okay?
Very good. Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Rick Zaharia. I am Vice President of the Consortium on Innovative Practices. I'm also project lead for our effort to support the Office of Protective Services in the Department of Developmental Services. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you what we've been working on with the department. They have engaged the consortium to assist in the development of an initiative to improve policy, practice, and investigative outcomes in the Office of Protective Services. In the context of a number of initiatives across several areas designed to improve practices at the state's 4 developmental centers, this initiative is designed to assist the Office of Protective Services in creating improvements in the identification and investigation of serious reportable incidents, allegations of abuse, and other criminal conduct. The consortium is a private, not-for-profit consulting corporation committed to improving practices in the field of developmental disabilities. The consortium and its consultants provide consultative services in a number of states in both institutional and community settings, including assisting states to address regulatory concerns, litigation, and agency performance problems. For example, consortium personnel are currently providing expert witness services in states experiencing litigation, and in other states are monitoring services pursuant to U.S. DOJ settlement agreements. The consortium is a national network of professionals around the country who have specialized expertise and experience in the field of developmental disabilities. We use a unique business model that combines strong project management with the commitment to obtaining the best possible resources for each project that we undertake. Our vision for the composition of each project team is not constrained by the need to support the internal staffing structure of a company. Instead, it starts with the questions, who are the best people available and how do we get them involved on this project? For this initiative, the consortium is using 2 individuals besides myself. They bring over 20 years of experience managing facilities, forensic services, and safety and security services in settings comparable to California's developmental centers. I have over 10 years experience running statewide DD systems and over 30 years experience managing DD facilities. all of us have dedicated our careers to ensuring that individuals with intellectual and other developmental disabilities are protected from harm. The consortium began working on the Best Practices Project for OPS in the fall of 2010 as a part of the Developmental Center Division's initiatives to develop a number of best practice projects for statewide systems improvement. The Incident and Investigations Work Group was originally convened to examine and recommend best practice policies for OPS. The overarching objective of these efforts was to ensure timely and effective investigations into serious incidents, allegations of abuse, and possible criminal conduct. This effort laid the groundwork for development and revision of a set of policies and procedures which is currently approaching completion. Beginning in October of 2011, the Developmental Centers Division assigned the consortium consultants to work directly with OPS staff at headquarters to finalize statewide policies to be used at all developmental centers. With the Chief of Protective Services and the Supervising Special Investigator, the consortium consultants convened as a leadership work team. We reviewed the input from the statewide work group, we surveyed practices in a number of states, and we drafted key documents that form a standardized and best practice basis for OPS investigations. The following changes and improvements have been made by the leadership group to key policies. We've revised them to reflect improved timelines upon the initial discovery of a reportable incident. We've clarified what are serious reportable incidents that need to be investigated. We've required earlier involvement of the special investigator in the discovery process. We've required first responders to contact local law enforcement for serious reportable incidents, allegations of abuse, and deaths. We've required completion of a preliminary first responder report by the end of the work shift. We've required simultaneous transmission of preliminary reports to commanders and supervising special investigators in order to better comply with reporting requirements. We've standardized the content and format of reports across the facilities. We've established a protocol for headquarters monitoring of quality and timeliness of all investigations. We've outlined the mechanism by which allegations of abuse occurring outside the developmental center in the general community will be reported to outside law enforcement. We've established uniform requirements for investigator performance regarding all investigations based on best practices in law enforcement, and we've provided a framework for the monitoring of investigator performance in relationship to these guidelines. The work group has also completed flowcharts to detail and illustrate the steps required in the new policies and their interface with facility risk management processes. We've drafted training curriculum for each of the new and revised policies and procedures, and we've developed timetables for the rollout and implementation of these revised policies, including the retraining of all first responders and investigators. We are recommending that the department initiate a two-phase approach with an immediate retraining of key policies at the developmental centers, including an introduction to needed improvements in performance expectations for first responders and investigators. We believe this can be done within 90 days. We have also identified certain process interface elements internal to the developmental centers which offer an opportunity to further evaluate and enhance the quality of the investigative process. These elements include the facility's conduct of its risk management activities and reporting requirements on the clinical side of the house. While OPS conducts an investigation, the risk management side of the house at a developmental center needs to be conducting activities that will ensure individuals are safe and are protected from re-injury without disrupting the integrity of the OPS investigation. The necessary changes, including the completion of a preliminary report by OPS, in our opinion, should be piloted at a developmental center in a complete reconfiguration around all systems critical to the protection from harm investigative processes. We believe this pilot can be implemented after the above training with coaching support from DDS and technical assistance. In addition to this, our survey of systems elsewhere around the country suggests that states that have centralized investigation units have used a program integrity strategy that has investigators reporting directly to their central offices. While currently regional commanders do report to central office, the supervising investigators and line investigators should also be reporting directly to the designated supervisor in DDS. We have recommended DDS consider restructuring along these lines. Finally, we are recommending at least a year of monthly audit visits to all facilities to assess implementation of revised policies, changed processes, and the heightened expectations in investigation quality. We're recommending that the leadership group develop the tools and methodology so that going forward, the department and OPS have a quality management mechanism to regularly assess system quality. And second, create the metrics that will indicate whether the outcome of improved protection from harm for the folks living at developmental centers is being achieved. We believe these strategies will result in immediate enhancements in performance and near-term improvements in systemic operations. The work group has proposed an implementation plan that will roll out and complete competency-based training over the next 90 days and initiate a facility pilot within 120 days. This systems change effort will require intense resources and administrative attention for at least the next year. The outcome is expected to be improved investigations supporting needed personnel actions in criminal prosecutions. In conclusion, over the past few years, OPS has developed a number of new policies. It has reduced investigator caseloads, reduced investigation backlogs. These and other organizational improvements, such as improved recruiting strategies, paperless documentation systems, real-time information systems, and so on, need to continue concurrent with these initiatives that I've described to you. The department has a unique and valuable asset in its Office of Protective Services. In our national review, we only found 3 other states with a dedicated workforce solely dedicated to abuse investigations in developmental centers. The situations for most other states is that they are forced to rely on local law enforcement to investigate allegations of abuse, or they're required to rely on overworked, under-resourced adult and child protective services in their state. And that's the case I have in Arizona, in my home state. These situations are usually unsatisfactory because of the low priority that institutional allegations of abuse have for these authorities. Therefore, the Office of Protective Services in DDS represents a resource which, while in need of improvements, very likely results in a larger investigative presence than that which is available in many states around the country. While some improvements are evident in the processes and practices of OPS, more remains to be done to ensure that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are safe and fully protected from harm. Madam Chair, members of the committee, that concludes my remarks. I'll be happy to take questions whenever that's appropriate.
Thank you very much. Ms. Billingsley.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. I am Kathleen Billingsley, Chief Deputy Director for Policy and Programs in the Department of Public Health. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the Department of Public Health's role in regulating the provision of health care services at the developmental centers licensed to the Department of Developmental Services. The licensing and certification program within CDPH licenses over 30 types of healthcare facilities so they can legally conduct business in California. This represents approximately 8,000 facilities and agencies in California. The purpose of the program is to protect the health and safety of patients, clients, and residents receiving care in facilities through periodic licensing surveys and federal certification inspections. Inspections are also triggered by complaints from the public about a specific facility or by events reported directly by the facility. One of the most important oversight activities is the complaint and facility reported event investigations. These investigations focus on the specific areas of a complaint, but may be expanded if system-wide problems are detected. Survey staff utilize interviews, observation, and record review as part of their protocol to determine if a facility has violated any state or federal regulation or statute. It is important to note that CDPH does not conduct criminal investigations. If, during an investigation, there is suspected criminal activity, the information is forwarded to the local law enforcement and the Department of Justice. If local law enforcement opens a criminal investigation, the licensure investigation is deferred to ensure the criminal investigation is not hindered. CDPH may also refer findings to the appropriate professional licensing boards for further action. The web-based Health Facilities Consumer Information System provides consumers with information about licensed long-term care facilities and hospitals, such as ownership, certification status, acceptance of Medicare and/or Medi-Cal, and performance history, including complaints, entity-reported incidents, state enforcement actions, and survey deficiencies. The system is mandated by state law, and the information is populated from a federal reporting system. The Health Facility Consumer Information System provides important information for consumers. However, the system does have limitations in that it does not allow for a reported outcome other than substantiated or unsubstantiated, which could lead to misinterpretation. CDPH is working on a plan to improve this system as a tool for consumers and others to use to evaluate facilities. We are committed to making the changes necessary to improve the quality of the information that is publicly available. When CDPH receives a complaint or a facility-reported incident, it is investigated. For complaints that are substantiated with deficiencies, the investigation finds evidence that the reported incident occurred, and in the course of the investigation, it is determined that the facility was not compliant with federal or state law. A deficiency is issued to the facility, and the facility must then submit a plan of correction to the department to immediately remedy their procedures. For example, a patient complains he was physically assaulted by another patient. The investigation finds evidence that the assault occurred and the facility failed to appropriately assess and implement care plans to protect patients in the facility from harm. For complaints substantiated without deficiencies, the investigation finds evidence that the reported incident occurred, but that there was either no evidence or insufficient evidence that state or federal laws were violated. For example, a facility reports an injury of unknown origin has taken place. The investigation finds evidence that the patient has a bruise, but through observation interviews and the review of records, there is insufficient evidence to suspect abuse or neglect as the cause of the bruise. The investigation would also include a review of the facility's policies and procedures to determine if the facility provided appropriate levels of care and supervision to prevent patient harm. For complaints that are unsubstantiated, the investigation cannot find evidence to substantiate the reported incident. Example: a patient complains that he was physically assaulted. The investigation finds no evidence of an assault or injury through its observation, interviews, or review of video, audio, or written records. Also, if CDPH suspects or becomes aware of charting irregularities, CDPH will investigate the charge. CDPH has the authority under the Health and Safety Code to investigate for willful material falsification or willful material omission in the health record of a patient. A violation of willful material falsification or willful material omission may result in a civil penalty not to exceed $10,000. CDPH has analyzed the number of complaint and facility reported events for 2008, 2009, and 2010, and the number of individual deficiencies written during the same time period for DDS, developmental centers. The number of total complaints and facility reported events at DDS facilities has been relatively consistent over the past several years, with a very slight decline of about 3%. I have been asked to comment on CDPH's authority to sanction individual workers if inappropriate action is found. CDPH licenses or certifies the following health professionals that work in long-term care facilities: certified nurse assistants, home health aides, certified hemodialysis technicians, and home nursing home administrators. If a direct care staff working in an intermediate care facility holds a certificate or license issued by CDPH and an allegation or complaint of inappropriate action is received, CDPH will investigate. Allegations of inappropriate action could include a criminal conviction that is substantially related to the duties and functions of the position, unprofessional conduct, abuse, neglect, or misappropriation. If the allegation or complaint is substantiated, CDPH will take administrative actions that may include suspension, revocation, or diversion or probation of a license. If the healthcare worker is not regulated by CDPH, a referral to the appropriate licensing board, such as the medical board or the board of registered nursing, will be made. In closing, I would like to reiterate that patient safety is the #1 priority for CDPH. We take seriously the obligation to enforce patient safety laws and regulations. In addition, we are obligated to ensure that the tools, such as the Health Facility Consumer Information System, communicate understandable data and information. CDPH is currently working to modify the database to provide better information. We welcome the opportunity to work with the legislature and the community to continuously improve our programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You stated that the number of reported incidents really has not climbed dramatically over the last several years. Do you differentiate about different kinds of abuses, serious crimes versus misdemeanors, or other, kinds of crimes?
Well, we look at different types of activities in different categories, but when I pointed out the number of complaints, what we did was really go back and look at the categories that we would use to capture incidents of abuse. So that would be resident, patient, client abuse. That would be client on client. Two people are walking down the hallway and they get in an argument and fight. Staff to client abuse, neglect, physical restraint or isolation, and excessive medication. So we basically went back and pulled all of the records for this and identified that in the 5 facilities, DDS facilities, we had a total over a 3-year period, again looking at 08, 09, and 10, 89 cases.
Were any of those cases reported or had investigations more than, or do you know that?
These were investigations conducted by CDPH.
Okay.
I don't have the information as to which of these was actually referred either to the Department of Justice or to another local law enforcement agency.
Okay. In the meantime, I'd like to welcome my fellow members to the committee. And we just started with panel 1 and just finished up. Any of you have questions? Okay. Senator Emerson, right? Senator Emerson first.
Thank you. Mr. Zaharia, in your statement, are you saying that an internal investigative unit is preferable to relying on local law enforcement or child protective services?
Madam Chair, Mr. Emerson, what we're saying is that the presence of OPS in the department compared to other states gives you a larger investigative footprint in the developmental centers than you might find in another state. If you're relying on only local law enforcement or adult protective services, as we do in Arizona, the frequency of your investigations of high quality are nominal. The number of investigations that OPS produces for the department gives you simply a larger presence, a larger investigative presence than you would without them.
Let me ask a second part of that question then. So with OPS, do they ever call in child protective services or local law enforcement to further those investigations?
Madam Chair, Mr. Emerson, I believe developmental center employees are mandated reporters and would have to make those notifications, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Senator Hancock?
Yeah, I just wondered, in one of these California Watch articles that we received, it says that there were 327 patient abuse cases noted since 2006. You said the number was 89. Is that just in the last few years?
No, that would be 08, 09, and 10.
Okay.
I did take the time to to point out to you that the health facility consumer information system has limitations and can misrepresent the data in some way. So basically, what would happen is that the person who was going to go out and was receiving the complaint or facility reported event, basically it would be like a phone call usually from a developmental center, and they would say this is a potential for abuse or describe a situation. And then the person in licensing and certification then makes a judgment without information as to what that potential category could be. So if it says abuse on there, then that would stay there for a period of time. Again, because of the fact that it can only be categorized as unsubstantiated or substantiated, that's a difficulty, because substantiated with deficiencies likely means that there was a case of abuse in which a deficiency or violation was found. But there can be a significant number of cases in which there's an allegation of abuse that says substantiated, but it is not proven to be an actual case of abuse. So this has resulted in a difference between the numbers that California Watch had and the numbers that I have provided today.
Okay, but so the 89 cases would be really in the 5 facilities that are state-run facilities.
That's correct.
Right?
Yes.
And that's about 1,800 people?
I believe so.
Right.
That are still in there. I think it would be important to know how many were actually referred
To other agents?
to a DA's office, to local police, to whomever, to just figure out some of the things that we might need to do to make it better.
Right.
Can you get those figures? Or are those
Yes, we
things
can. Basically, what we'll go through, and we will actually review each of the survey reports, and the survey report itself should indicate whether there was a referral that was made to, for instance, a local.
So maybe either the two of you could comment or subsequent speakers, but it struck me that we're really talking about the need for prevention too, and I appreciate that there's going to be training for the police officers, but it seems to me that this is challenging work that requires a certain kind of person to do it, and that there ought to be more training for staff on the prevention end, but I didn't see that was called for. And then I had the same question as Senator Emerson. It does seem to me that an in-house police force runs a risk of being too closely intertwined with the agency itself. And if we gave resources to local child protective services or to local police officers, might that not be a more effective way to deal with these kinds of things?
That's for you.
That's for Rick. Right.
Madam Chair, Ms. Hancock, to the first question, one of the initiatives that the department launched a year and a half ago was indeed the protection from harm, best practice guidelines for the clinical side of the house, and that's in its final stages and probably will result in some additional training and activities to prevent injury and prevent abuse. There are any number of ways that you could replace OPS investigations, but they need to be resourced. Just ask an Adult Protective Services Department or a Child Protective Service Department to pick up what OPS is doing now would be, I think, extremely problematic.
Well, that's why I said I think that you would have to work out that, but I'm just thinking about the actual separation of functions. And then I had just one last question for you actually, Mr. Zaharia. You've seen a lot of states. Are there any one or two states that you would say do this particularly well that we could look at for best practices?
Yes, Ms. Hancock, we've suggested that the department, and I believe they have been in contact with Massachusetts. Massachusetts has done a number of interesting things around their protective services operations. They have a centralized investigative unit. It works both community and institutional settings, but they've initiated an entire initiative with local district attorneys and local law enforcement to, in fact, build relationships between those internal investigators and the prosecutors who have to make the case and prosecute, and the local law enforcement who are reluctant sometimes to come in. So yes, we've recommended that the department talk with Massachusetts about that initiative. It's called Building Relationships, and seems to have made a difference in increasing prosecutions and so forth.
Yeah, I would hope in the end we'd do the training and the prevention and the programming in the institutions.
Right.
Yeah, so we wouldn't have to do that. But thank you. That's actually very helpful.
Senator Wright?
I guess in the cases that we've had, how many people have actually been prosecuted and sent to jail? So I guess the question for me when you get a number and you say 200 people, 300 people, it has no relevance to anything because it's 200 out of what? It's 89 out of what? How many people went to jail for abusing patients?
I think that we have an opportunity through the work that we do to give you the information regarding referrals. It would be beyond our scope, but we could see what we can do as far as the outcomes of our referrals or the outcomes of the referrals to the local enforcement agencies.
Ask another one. How many people have been fired in the last 5 years for abusing patients?
I'm not aware of the intricacies of the developmental center's numbers.
I think that last panel that Terry Delgadillo can shed some light on that.
I'm saying, but I mean, the challenge becomes often, again, like I'm giving statistics. There's an old jazz song that was called "Compared to What," and in the absence of knowing what I'm comparing it to, the number becomes much less informative. If I know how to compare it, if you like, Mr. Zaharia, you said that the police force that you have would be better than if you had one that was outside. Based on what?
Mr. Wright, what I said was that without OPS, there would be a lot less investigations available to pursue personnel actions, prosecutions where they do occur, to simply remove OPS and rely on local adult protective services, child protective services, local law enforcement. The states that have that situation, it's a very unsatisfactory situation. The investigative processes just aren't as large and as prevalent as they are with OPS. So the alternative, our recommendation is that you either keep OPS in there and improve quality, or you fund an investigative unit, an adult and child protective services, comparable to what you have in OPS.
Well, but there's another option. There are other people here in California who perform similar functions to what you do. And it would be informative to look at whether or not their rates of mortality or prosecution or other things are comparable to yours. Because we might find, for example, that the other systems work better. And we might find that they work better for less money. So we could end up paying more and getting less unless you have something to compare it to. And I would submit I don't necessarily need to go to Massachusetts, although, Boston is kind of cool in a minute. It's a little chilly right now. But it it might well be that we can look at other institutions and other models are performing the same care. There are nursing homes, and compare that to what they do. Most of the private facilities don't have their own police department, and there seem to be issues that get adjudicated, and it might be that it's less expensive to do it that way and more effective. I don't know, but I think that would become a question that we need something to compare it to. One incidence is one too many, but in the absence of having some relative data to compare it to, I think it becomes a challenge. And I'm kind of like some of the other members of the committee, is that one of the reasons that we never let Colonel Sanders watch chickens was that you soon would end up with no chickens. If the police department and the people who they're watching over are being paid by the same person, at a minimum, you'd have the appearance of a conflict of interest. In whether or not that in fact occurs, but part of what we want to do is to avoid even the appearance of a conflict. And so to have the same group in charge of the entire process probably raises questions to some folks' mind. But I'd be curious to know, if we could, how many people got prosecuted, how many people were injured severely and or died while they were in the care, and how does that compare to institutions within California that provide favorable or comparable care? In having something like that to measure the output or the performance of the police department against.
Okay, Senator Berryhill.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to go slow here. Ms. Billingsley, you mentioned that the CDPH doesn't conduct criminal investigations. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. How long after DDS reports an incident does it take CDPH to let, if it's a crime, how long does it take for them to notify law enforcement?
Of the complaints and facility reported events that we receive, for instance, our overall long-term care residents, we initiate our complaints within 10 days, which means we go on site and review the situation. If indeed we receive information that indicates that there has been a more egregious issue that could result in actual harm or potential harm to a resident or patient, then we actually go out within 48 hours, most often 24 hours. And those numbers that I provided to you, that initiation of a complaint takes place 99% of the time within 10 working days.
10 days, because the longer it takes to let these guys know, the harder it is to investigate, of course.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
I understand what you just said. So if a person died at one of the facilities, the investigation may not take place for 10 days?
No. I differentiated between a death or actual harm compared to a complaint could come in that says, I don't mean to pick something frivolous, but we do receive complaints regarding the timing of when meals are delivered, and so, or some type of care, some type of issue would not result in harm to a patient. Those would occur within 10 days. If indeed a death has occurred in the facility, we would be out there within the next working day. So if we receive a report,
let me see if I understand. So let's say that a crime potentially occurred in the facility.
yes,
It would be an entire day before anybody did.
I'm sorry. Within 24 hours.
Okay, let's take.
Okay,
let's
I apologize
within,
for not being clear.
Okay, but within 24 hours. Okay.
Yes.
See, I guess that troubles me a bit. If something happened on 76 and Halldale that was a crime, there would be a police response inside of 20 minutes. Not 24 hours, but 20 minutes. And 20 minutes would be a long time. And part of the reason that I want the response faster is that the longer it takes to begin the investigation, the more the evidence deteriorates. I mean, so if it took you 24 hours, if that were, I mean, on its face, that's an unacceptable standard for an incident where there might have been a crime or a death.
Correct. Okay.
I'm just saying. I mean, if in South LA, 20 minutes is too long, in large part because you don't want the evidence destroyed.
Yes.
I mean, for example, if there was a crime that took place in your facility, I would hope that someone would come in and make sure that no one was walking in and out of the room, that someone would mask off the evidence and make sure that things didn't get away. If there were things that the patient was drinking, if there were records, I would hope that all of that information would be seized immediately so that you protected the potential crime scene. In a day, who knows what happens? So, I mean, the orderly walks in, mops the floor. I mean, I'm just saying that gives me pause as I'm listening to you describe your system.
I am describing what we do in the licensing and certification program with respect to looking at violations of state and federal laws. The licensing and certification program does not take the lead for contacting local law enforcement immediately when there's a death in a facility, or one of the protective services taking action immediately on site and calling law enforcement. Oftentimes, once law enforcement is contacted, the licensing and certification program would go out within 24 hours, but will usually be asked to step back and allow law enforcement to conduct its activities. We do not conduct investigations of criminal actions and events. That is, we are not the police. We are not the local law enforcement agency. We have a very, very defined scope that looks at the regulatory oversight of patient safety with respect to federal and state laws. So I absolutely agree with you. My son is a DA and is on homicide right now, and I'm well aware of the extent of the responsiveness that they take in California, and we certainly would never be placed in a situation of we are not the entity that would be acting in this fashion. So I think it would be important for you to speak to DDS and to those who are who have a different role than we do.
Oh, okay.
So I don't mean to sideline your question.
No, that's okay.
It's an important question.
But if the answer is that that's not what you do, I got it. Now save it and refer that to the next panel. If that's not what you do,
yes, sir.
I mean, I just thought I understood something, and I'm thinking, boy, that ain't what you want to do when you're running an airline. But I'll save it for later.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Can you tell me, Ms. Billingsley, can your data tell us anything about trends at our developmental centers? Can you project behavioral things that are happening at the center?
We do look at trends over periods of time with respect to certain types of substantiated complaints, and we look at different types of citations that are issued for a certain facility. So we do look at a number of different types of trends. So if there's any information that I can provide, please let me know.
Okay. So do you report that to DSS?
It's public information.
Public information.
It's public information. The information's available at any point in time. That information is on the Health Facility Consumer Information System, and to my knowledge, they track every incident very, very closely. As you know, they have a zero tolerance for abuse and other adverse events at their facilities.
Okay. And Mr. Zaharia, I'm sorry. The DOJ, and they're going to be part of the testimony too, came up with a group of recommendations in 2002. And some of your recommendations, are they the same? Are they different from it's a a forward document that you submitted to DSS?
Madam Chair, the recommendations from that report overlap with our recommendations, probably about 50%. We agree pretty much on improvements needed in training and policy development and whatnot. There are some areas where we part ways, perhaps because of perspective. But for the most part, we do. We're pretty much on target with their recommendations.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both very much. Are there any other questions for these members? Okay. Thank you. Let's move on to the second panel, which will give us a kind of an historical perspective of the developmental centers. We'll invite Leslie Morrison, Disability Rights. Welcome. Kobe Bizzotti from the Legislative Liaison for the California State Law Enforcement Association, an investigator from Office of the Protective Services, James Klein, and Thomas Sims from the Department of Justice. Thank you for joining us. And let's start with Ms. Morrison.
Thank you for the opportunity to address your committee today. I'm Leslie Morrison. I'm the director of the Investigations Unit at Disability Rights California, and I think that copies of my written testimony are going around. I'm going to be following along, and will cue you as I go.
Okay.
Disability Rights California is the agency mandated under federal law to advocate for Californians with disabilities. One of our most critical functions is to investigate allegations of abuse and neglect involving people with disabilities. I'm the director of the division that is primarily responsible for this mandate. I'm an attorney. I used to be a registered nurse. I have a master's degree in psychiatric nursing, so I'm fairly familiar with some healthcare issues. We have conducted over 500 investigations since we've been record-keeping involving abuse and neglect of people with disabilities. Over 60 of those involved allegations in developmental centers. Turning to page 2 of my testimony, we have long been focused on the failures of the abuse response in criminal justice systems to responding to allegations of abuse, neglect, and crimes against people with disabilities. And I want to just mention a few highlights. I brought some copies of our report, and I believe that they were also referenced in some materials. The first one I want to reference is a 2003 report that we wrote in collaboration with our partners under the Federal Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act. We refer to that as the white paper here. It criticized investigators both in the community and in the developmental centers for a lack of expertise in conducting investigations involving people with developmental disabilities. We called for the legislature to make abuse and neglect of people with developmental disabilities a top priority. In 2005, we published a report about a series of suspicious genital lacerations at one developmental center. We called for the department to ensure that suspicious injuries were immediately reported and promptly investigated by the Office of Protective Services. In 2006, we issued a small advisory about the sexual assault of a man with developmental disability living in the community. We called for law enforcement in the community to immediately and thoroughly investigate crimes against people with disabilities. And most recently, in 2010, we published a report about a series of cases of physical and sexual assaults involving nursing home residents by care staff. And again, we asked the legislature to focus on protecting people with disabilities from abuse and ensure that there is prompt and thorough investigations. After the news reports of the suspicious deaths and abuse in developmental centers appeared in the media, the department asked for us to conduct an immediate independent review of the department's response to these incidents. I'm now on page 3. We began this preliminary review last week. We focused on 3 categories initially. The first one is suspicious and unexpected deaths. The next is sexual assault allegations involving staff, and the third was serious injuries of unknown origin. We looked at, we had the department pull all of those cases for the last 3 years at the 5 current open developmental centers. We looked at every one of the deaths, which was a total of 74, and we, because didn't have time, we did 30 of the sexual assaults, and we looked at about 20 of the serious injuries of unknown origin. We looked at the abuse reporting within the developmental centers all the way up to DDS headquarters, and we also looked at the Office of Protective Services response. Almost all of the cases that we looked at were not suggestive of abuse and neglect. The developmental centers serve a fragile and often elderly population that has complicated disability-related and medical issues. On page 4, none of the deaths were suggestive of abuse, and we looked at 74. All of the deaths that had occurred, and these are suspicious or unexpected deaths. Many of the deaths occurred in acute care hospitals, involved residents who had well-known medical conditions and for which they were receiving treatment in the hospital for. 5 of the deaths did show negligent lapses in staff supervision that was directly or proximately contributing to the deaths. We had already been notified and had fully investigated 3 of those cases. A handful of other deaths suggested that quality of care or treatment might have been a proximate cause. For example, we looked at the death of an individual who died in an acute care hospital. The cause of his death was related to an ulcer that was caused by a checker piece that he had ingested at some point earlier, and he had died from an ulcer. So in that case, we felt that negligent supervision at some point at the developmental center was likely a contributing cause. Some of the cases, we felt that the investigators at the Office of Protective Services did not appear to sufficiently probe if neglect was a contributing factor, and the checker piece case is an example of this. On page 5, most of the sexual assault allegations were reliably found to be false accusations, often quickly recanted. And I'll give you a few examples. In one case, a resident called the Office of Protective Services directly, and reported that the individual had been continuously sexually and physically assaulted by 5 staff members, touching her body everywhere, every day. OPS promptly responded. They conducted an investigation. They secured evidence from the bedding and her clothing. They sent it to outside law enforcement to detect if there was any semen, and there was none detected. Nearly all of the victims were examined by physicians at the developmental center and were found to have no evidence of injuries. However, none of the victims were sent for an independent sexual assault examination. This has led Disability Rights California to question if the physicians within the developmental centers have the training and expertise to conduct sexual assault exams and gather forensic evidence. We don't know. We also wonder about the skills and training of the Office of Protective Service investigators in conducting interviews with sexual assault victims. We did have the opportunity to compare the quality of the investigations done by outside law enforcement with the Office of Protective Services just serendipitously. We happen to have an open case right now involving a sexual assault allegation of a female consumer, a woman with a developmental disability who lives in the community that happens to house a developmental center where 2 female residents made similar sexual assault allegations. In the community case, it was promptly reported to the police, who responded. The officer who responded saw that the woman had a developmental disability. It did not attempt to interview her. He referred the case to a detective who took over a week to interview the victim. In the case of the Office of Protective Services, the officers immediately responded. They interviewed both of the victims, the alleged perpetrator, and went on to do a thorough investigation. Neither case was referred to the district attorney. Bottom of page 5, we also looked at injuries of unknown origin. This was a very large category. The department has a very broad definition for injuries of unknown origin that warrant reporting. We randomly selected injuries that we thought were particularly concerning, namely fractures of the femur, of the back, large bones. We looked at incidents of genital injuries, lacerations, and injuries that might possibly be caused by an assault, like fat lips, black eyes, that kind of thing. In these cases, most of the individuals were nonverbal. They had very profound disabilities and very profound cognitive impairments. They also often had complicated medical conditions that greatly increased their risk. for injury, like osteoporosis, epilepsy, gait disturbances, blindness. Unlike injuries like this in the community, they would not have triggered any response by law enforcement. So a broken femur, a fat lip, a black eye, none of that would have, in our opinion, triggered outside law enforcement to come and do an investigation. In these cases, the injuries were reported within minutes of being discovered, and the Office of Protective Services initiated an investigation either the same day or with the investigators coming the following day. We again question whether the facility physicians have sufficient training and experience in conducting forensic examinations. In select cases, we also wondered if the Office of Protective Services investigators sufficiently probed whether abuse and neglect was a possible cause. And I think, again, a case example here is helpful. We looked at a case where a developmental center resident was found to have a fractured clavicle, which is your collarbone. He is profoundly disabled and nonverbal and was unable to explain how the injury occurred. Staff speculated that the injury was caused by him perhaps tripping over a treadmill that was folded and stored in one of the group rooms. This would have been a case where we would have liked to have seen the investigators perhaps probe a little bit further to see whether abuse and neglect could have been a cause. One of the concerns here is generally if somebody trips, they put their arm out and break their fall with their arm and don't tend to land on their collarbone. So in that, it would have been something where we would have liked someone to have probed a little bit further to have tried to find. You can also age fractures by looking at the x-ray and be able to try to figure out closer in time when that fracture might have occurred and to see whether he was participating in activities in that group room or whether even the treadmill was in the group room at the time. Page 6, about the investigations generally. All of the incidents were reported within minutes of being discovered to the Office of Protective Services, and hospital patrol officers responded immediately. Investigators started their investigation the same day or the next day. Most of the investigations were much more timely and thorough than what we would see in the community, much more. Many would never have caught the attention of outside law enforcement. Every single death that occurred at the developmental center was reported to the coroner except when the family refused to consent. And so that meant that all of those, maybe 72 of those deaths, all went to the county coroner and they all received autopsies. And again, this is not something that we would typically see in the community. Every suspicious injury was reported and investigated. Most of the sexual assault victims were examined by the physician, even those that recanted. Investigations were generally comprehensive and showed a familiarity with facility records, work practices, scheduling, and they interviewed the victims. And again, this is not something we see in the community. Every one of the victims was attempted to be interviewed, even those with serious injuries of unknown origin where their disability precluded them from providing any meaningful information. Again, we had some findings here. One is that there seemed to be some variability in the documentation by the Office of Protective Services, including terminology about investigations outcomes. There's also a separate review process that facility managers use. That's folks up the clinical chain, and that review seemed a little bit cursory and not particularly probing, and I've given you an example where both of those investigations take place simultaneously and they give you different information. For example, if you have a restraint-related injury, the Office of Protective Services would go in to see if there was concern about excessive or inappropriate use of restraint that might rise to the level of abuse, whereas the clinicians might be looking to see whether the person needs to have a change in their plan of care. Maybe other alternatives need to be attempted to avoid using restraint. On page 7, I want to just put into context what we're talking about here. People with disabilities are at a disproportionately high risk of abuse, neglect, and criminal victimization. I have a lot of statistics I could throw at you, but I'll just give you some. Studies say people with disabilities are 4 to 10 times more likely to be victimized than the regular population. People with cognitive or intellectual impairments are at the highest risk, with over 10 times the rate of criminal victimization than the normal population. Conservatively, 80% of women with developmental disabilities will be sexually assaulted at least once in their lifetime. 30% of men will be. 50% of sexual assault victims with developmental disabilities will be victimized 10 or more times. Law enforcement response to crimes against people with disabilities is significantly lower than the normal population, and prosecutions and convictions are few. Okay, moving on to our recommendations. Our recommendations really encompass reform that's focused at issues within the developmental centers and also to the larger issue of abuse and neglect of people with disabilities. This hearing is an opportunity to develop a systemic reform to protect people with developmental disabilities living in the developmental centers as well as in the community. On page 9, I start with my recommendations, and they're really into 3 buckets. The first one is directed at the department, the second one is directed at community law enforcement, and the third is directed at general systemic reform. Regarding the department, number 1, we do not recommend shifting the responsibility for investigating abuse and neglect in the developmental centers entirely to outside law enforcement. Our experience is that outside law enforcement often loathe to go into facilities, and they lack the skills and training to investigate cases involving victims with disabilities. We just don't think that if you close the Office of Protective Services and expect outside law enforcement to pick up these cases, you're going to get a better response than what you're getting with the Office of Protective Services. Many instances investigated by the Office of Protective Services would never have triggered a law enforcement investigation by outside law enforcement investigators. Second, we recommend requiring the department to define critical incidents reported to local law enforcement. As you know, Welfare and Institutions Code 4427.5 requires all deaths and serious injuries of unknown origin be reported. And as we said in our audit, all of the deaths were reported to the county coroner. The documents that we looked at did not have a record of serious injuries being reported, but DDS has subsequently gathered that information and provided it to us. We haven't had a chance to review it yet. The department assures us that the documents they've pulled together showed that all of those injuries were also reported. The department has no such category of serious injuries of unknown origin. They have a category, injuries of unknown origin. As I said, that category is very broad, and in my written testimony, I've listed everything that they included. So we recommend that the department consult with abuse experts and refine the standards by which they refer cases to outside law enforcement to ensure that certain critical incidents are referred. These minimally should include sexual assault allegations and deaths. Page 10, my third recommendation is to ensure that physicians in the developmental centers maintain competencies in detecting signs of possible abuse and immediately refer these victims to trained forensic medical examiners, especially in the case of sexual assaults and serious suspicious injuries of unknown origin. We also recommend that the department partner with local sexual assault response teams to establish standard criteria to refer victims for examinations and to be interviewed. Fourth, we recommend that the Office of Protective Services resources be dedicated to investigating incidents suggestive of abuse, neglect, and crime. As I said earlier, many of the deaths were maybe unnecessarily referred to the Office of Protective Services for investigation. It may be that they don't necessarily require a full investigation, particularly when the cause of death is clearly attributed to a known medical condition. We recommend that the department refine the system so that the Office of Protective Services resources is dedicated to matters within their expertise, and they refer others to the proper oversight entity. And I have an example here. Some of these cases involve complex medical issues of causation that should have been referred and could be referred to the mortality review committees within the facilities. For example, we saw cases where folks died of pneumonia in the acute care hospital, where they had sepsis, and they also may have had an underlying urinary tract infection that could have caused the sepsis. Those are really complex medical causation issues that are probably beyond the expertise of the Office of Protective Services, but they certainly do warrant probing to see whether it was a secondary or proximate cause. So we recommend the department ensure that management and administrative reviews of incidents are sufficiently probing and that they take swift corrective action. Page 11, recommendation number 5, we recommend that the department augment their incident data system to detect patterns and trends. Their incident data system also captures incidents of events that happen in the community and may also capture problematic regional center vendors. All of this gives a rich database to be able to look at prevention opportunities, not just within the developmental center, but also spreading to people with disabilities in the community. And when you, Senator Hancock, asked about prevention, that's one of the things I thought about, is that database system can give you a nice opportunity to look at trends, both within problematic facilities and also if you're seeing a trend of genital lacerations, for example. Page 12, the department should report all unexpected and suspicious deaths and sexual assaults involving staff members to us or the State Protection and Advocacy Agency. We receive very few Department of Public Health citations related to developmental centers. I think that maybe we have in the past 2 to 3 years only gotten 2 to 3 a year involving incidents occurring in developmental centers, and oftentimes we get those months to as much as a year after they were issued, and oftentimes months or years have lapsed since the incident occurred. We also are getting those redacted, which means the pages are completely blacked out. Under our access authority, we are able to get them unredacted, but it's a time-consuming, resource-intensive process, so we'd like to get direct reporting from the department. On page 13, I start my recommendations in the local law enforcement bucket. The first one is that you require local law enforcement to partner with OPS. Both could benefit from each other's experiences. Local law enforcement have the experience in crime scene evidence collection, and the Office of Protective Services has experience working with people with disabilities and familiarity with the practices and procedures in developmental centers. We also recommend that local law enforcement receive and be required or ensured that they are competent in investigating cases involving people with disabilities. They should partner with advocates in the community. This may also be a good role for the Department of Justice, Bureau of Medical Fraud and Elder Abuse. They have a mandate to provide training to law enforcement and prosecutors. It's our understanding that that training has not occurred in a number of years, and we recommend that they resume that training requirement. The last bucket is recommendations for systemic changes. The first one is that we amend the Mandated Abuse Reporting Act to require reporting incidents immediately of abuse and neglect immediately to both law enforcement and the long-term care ombudsman when those occur in nursing homes. And I just wanted to speak to a minute to Senator Wright's questions. When you have an incident that occurs in any of these facilities or anywhere, an incident of abuse and neglect, there are two reporting systems. One is the mandated abuse reporting system, where incidents of abuse are reported immediately to either law enforcement or another entity. If it occurs in the community, those reports go to Adult Protective Services. If they occur in long-term care facilities, the mandated reporter has the option to report to either the long-term care ombudsman or law enforcement. Incidents in developmental centers get reported to either the Office of Protective Services or outside law enforcement. That's a different track than what Kathleen Billingsley was talking about. The track that she is on is regarding licensing and regulatory violations. So they're two separate tracks. And here we're recommending that the or get changed to an and, so that both law enforcement and the long-term care ombudsman get notified. Number two, we recommend that we get immediately unredacted citation reports involving incidents of people with developmental and psychiatric disabilities. Number three, we recommend the development of a coordinated system across the state that will look at the larger issue of abuse and neglect of people with disabilities. We recommend that this start with a uniform system of data collection to see the scope of the problem and where reform is focused, and also to designate a lead agency to spearhead this issue. And again, to address one of your questions about comparing data that you had mentioned, this is going to be a difficulty because there is no data in the community. The best data we have is in these institutions. So, for example, crime reports do not collect information about whether the crime victim has a disability or not. So we do not really know the scope of the problem. The statistics that I presented to you are based on studies that have been done, but we do not know the spread of the issue in the community. We don't know how many are investigated, how many are reported to law enforcement, how many law enforcement investigate, how many are referred to the DA to prosecute, and how many prosecutions there are, because we do not, across the system, track disability information of the victim. Lastly, we recommend that there be a system developed to report and track abusive care staff. Right now, the system in place is a criminal fingerprinting system, so many care staff are required to be fingerprinted, and their fingerprints are run through a criminal background check, but that, of course, requires a criminal conviction. It's not a very inclusive check. So we recommend the development of a system where abusive care staff who have been found to have a substantiated complaint by a licensing agency such as the Department of Public Health, that they go into a database so that we can keep track of abusive care staff and stop them from moving from facility to facility. And again, this is another opportunity at prevention. So that concludes my remarks. I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'm also rather familiar with the Massachusetts model and happy to talk about that too. So
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Kobe?
Madam Chair, members, I'm Kobe Pizzati with California Statewide Law Enforcement Association. We represent the police officer and investigators at all the DDS and DMH facilities. Senator Wright, I wanted to immediately touch on your point on should there be a death at a DDS facility, it would be our officers that respond immediately to that situation when it arises. And to the point where Senator Hancock made earlier, one of our larger concerns that California Watch didn't talk about was all of these abuses are happening, and sometimes in great numbers, by staff. What California Watch did not talk about was how are these staff getting hired in the first place? And that's something we have a great concern with. And I think you just kind of touched on that, as well as there's no tracking of staff because there is no, it requires a criminal conviction before a staff would be placed in a background check situation where it would be noted. Anyway, on to my testimony. Much like DMH, our DDS members have had meetings with executives, and we have raised some of our security concerns over the past several years. We have asked the administration at both agencies to provide better ongoing training. We've requested better pay for recruitment and retention issues, and we've also requested the ability to carry the tools that they need to do the jobs in terms of firearms, protective vests, pepper spray, or a baton of some kind. It's hard to really paint the picture as to what a police officer or an investigator does at a DDS facility, because each facility is different. Sonoma is a unique facility because it has a highway actually running through the middle of that facility. Our officers are in marked patrol cars, and they perform traffic stops. They do this as an unarmed police officer in a uniform in a marked police car. I think if you talk to any local police officer, one of the most dangerous jobs they do in their day is a traffic stop. So that's one of the main issues that we've had with the police officers and the Department of Developmental Services. However, we do want to say that we believe that the Office of Protective Services structure is a sound structure. However, we believe that its operation needs to be somewhat independent from the administration. When you have administrators that are responsible for protecting the licensing, as well as staff and patients and the safety at the facilities, or I shouldn't say patients, the consumers, you have kind of a conflicting role in which the preservation of justice may not jive exactly with what the licensing requirements may be. So having said that, we believe that the OPS system is one that should work with maybe an independent chief of police that is experienced in law enforcement. I know the current chief at OPS's background is in firefighting. When you're running an office that conducts primarily law enforcement functions and investigations, it is critical that the head have extensive law enforcement experience. And we believe that that is something that needs to be addressed. We also believe that the chain of command should be the police officers should report to sergeants and lieutenants, and then the lieutenants should be reporting to their commanders at each facility. The commanders should run their facilities much like precinct captains would at your local police department. They should have the ability to speak to outside law enforcement, turn over investigations to the DA without having any sort of interference from the administration. We've had a number of cases reported from our investigators where they've actually been pressured to change reports, and when they refused, they've had the reports taken away from them and turned over to a Sacramento investigator. So this brings me back to our training. We have our peace officers and investigators are fully post-trained. This means they have 664 hours of training. POST is the California's independent commissions on peace officer standing and training. These officers can work at any sheriff's department in the state. This is something that our association has advocated for at the Department of Mental Health to implement as well. We want our peace officers and investigators' word to be beyond reproach, and making sure that the training that they receive is over and above is excellent. However, while our officers have initial excellent training out of the academy, DDS provides no investigator field training program. So essentially you have an investigator that the training they receive is on-the-job training. So they're essentially thrown into the deep end of the pool and asked to swim. Many of our investigators have asked for additional training, such like items like evidence collection, advanced witness and interview and interrogation techniques, and crime scene processing, but in many cases have been turned down. We have a lot of investigators that have requested sexual assault response training as well, and again, in many instances have been turned down. While our investigators have the same training as your standard police officer or detective, the on-the-job experience has taught them important clues on how to deal with different types of clients. Many have facial tics that indicate certain discomforts with a situation. Others have outbursts that are indicative of a deeper problem that local law enforcement, who are not familiarized with the clientele, would never understand what these clues mean. Furthermore, local law enforcement is not familiar with the standards, practices, policies, and procedures that would need to be considered when drawing conclusions for investigations at these types of facilities. Therefore, our officers and investigators have obtained a specialized skill set to the clientele they interact with on a regular basis, much like a police detective that specializes in a gang unit has extensive knowledge and skills to deal with those types of investigations. Assuming that local law enforcement has the resources available, an outside law enforcement agency simply cannot step in and pick up where our investigators leave off. Our investigators do, however, have excellent rapport with local law enforcement. However, the decision to consult or turn over a case to local law enforcement does not lie in the hands with our investigators. It's with the administration. And unfortunately, the commander has to get permission to contact local law enforcement. So thusly you have, again, somebody who's more concerned about licensing interfering in the role of justice. And this is where we have a problem. Once again, I want to touch on the problems that many of our investigators have seen over the years have left us into a situation where it's making it incredibly difficult to recruit and retain investigators. It's not the pay at the investigator level that makes the situation hard for a DDS investigator to stay at their job, because roughly the pay is the same at any investigative position throughout the state. Investigator Klein, he makes the same salary as a DMV investigator or a lottery agent investigator. So it's not the pay, that's standardized. What you have is an interference on behalf of the department and kind of a fox watching the hen house situation where their primary concern is licensing and not necessarily the results of certain investigations being reported to the district attorneys. We have 36 paid, or 30, we're budgeted for 36 investigator positions in this state. We have 17 filled. You have 19 vacancies. I think that is speaks volume. That's over a 50% vacancy rate. There is not one investigator classification at any other state agency that has a vacancy rate that large. At the Peace Officer 1 level, you have 93 budgeted positions for peace officers. 60 of them are filled. So again, you have over a 30% vacancy rate. Unfortunately, this is the issues we have been dealing with. With the Peace Officer 1 level, it's more of an issue of pay. They're the highest trained, lowest paid uniform officer in the state. And this is one of the reasons why you have a huge vacancy. With the investigator level, it's the investigations and the interference on the department that causes officers to leave. I had 5 other investigators that were more than willing to come and testify that have left for other agencies because on lateral transfers, not for pay raises, but for lateral transfers, because they were just tired of not being able to do the job that they were sworn to do. So I think that really will conclude my testimony. We do have one last point. We've asked for a policies and procedures manual and protocol to be completed. We've been promised for years now that this policies and procedures manual would be completed. We've even asked to help participate in creating this policy procedure manual so that it will be a well-functioning and vital tool that all law enforcement at DDS can use. Unfortunately, we have not seen or heard from DDS on whether or not it's been completed. I've heard from my officers that it has not been completed. We actually had an 11-year veteran peace officer at one of our facilities take the time and write a 348-page policies and procedures manual all by himself. He is also a reserve peace officer at Exeter PD. It's been turned into DDS management, and once again, nothing has been done. So I guess that's what I have to say. I'll answer any questions as you see fit. With me, I have Investigator James Klein. He is the CSLAA union representative and investigator at Canyon Springs Developmental Center.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Klein?
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Chair, committee members. Thank you for allowing me to appear here today. Basically, what I wanted to stress is the peace officers and the investigators in the DDS system for OPS are no different than the law enforcement that we see out in the streets. Their community is what they serve for you. They serve your community. My community, the investigators' community, the DDS, the officers' community, is the clients, are the clients, and the staff of this facility. As Kobe was saying, and others have said, some of the instances wouldn't even result in a law enforcement call-out from the community. As far as officers responding, and we're there within minutes. As soon as we get the call from staff, that there's an allegation of abuse, which can be either made from staff or the client themselves. Generally, we get calls directly from the clients, and we will go back there and immediately start an investigation. The preliminary investigation is conducted by the uniformed police officers, and if they cannot come to some kind of a disposition at that point, then it is turned over to the Special Investigations Unit. If it's a case of a death, we get called out in the middle of the night, where we respond. We have a, depending on what facility you're in, we have up to a 2-hour call out. And I personally have responded. We've only had a couple at our facility, but they've been off grounds, and they've been in the hospital, so they were expected. One of the reasons why we look into all death cases is to make sure that there's no possibility of abuse, neglect. If it is a medical condition, if it was an expected death, we note that. But our job is the protection of the clients even after they pass away. Our training, as Kobe mentioned, is the same as any peace officer in the state of California. We are post-certified, and then when we become investigators, we attend advanced officer training, which includes sexual assault training, investigative interrogation and interview techniques, search warrants, any advanced training that is required by any other detective in the state of California, we also have to attend, plus perishable skills, which keep us fresh every 2 years. Thank you. That's what I have, and if there's, I'll be available for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Sims?
Yes. Turn my microphone on.
Sure.
Excuse me. Good afternoon, Senator Liu and members of the committee. My name is Tom Sims. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you about this important topic. In the fall of 2000, Lauren Duchesne and I were retained by the AG's office to conduct an audit of law enforcement operations at the Department of Developmental Services, or DDS. Mr. Duchesne is the retired chief investigator for the Orange County DA's office. In that capacity, he supervised the work of more than 200 investigators. Since his retirement, he has consulted with a number of police departments in California. I had a 33-year career in law enforcement and retired as a Roseville police chief in 1999. Since then, I've been asked by 5 different cities to fill in as their interim police chief, most recently in Santa Rosa in 2008 and 2009. I'd like to preface my comments to you today by saying I am not affiliated with the Department of Justice. I did a very short stint as a consultant more than 10 years ago. So what I know about the department is based on that information and what I've read about and seen recently in the news media. During the spring and summer months of 2000, a number of issues were raised about the capabilities of DDS's law enforcement personnel. Members of the legislature asked the Attorney General to examine these issues in a review and make recommendations for improving the quality of police and investigative activities at the state developmental centers and for eliminating the likelihood of real or perceived conflict of interest for state employees in conducting these activities. The methodology we used to conduct our audit included a questionnaire that was completed by 71% of the peace officer staff. And I have to add that a number of the officers were very anxious to talk to us as we made our site visits and had a lot of very valuable information they provided to us. We made site visits at DDS headquarters in each of the 5 largest regional centers. We met with client right advocates, state and local agencies, and media representatives. We conducted more than 75 interviews, and we reviewed more than 4,000 pages of documentation. During our audit, we learned a great deal, including many of the employees working at DDS displayed a deep concern and care for the patients or consumers at these facilities. The DDS environment is not your typical police beat. People living in the developmental centers have unique needs and limitations. These DDS customers would present any law enforcement organization with challenges that are difficult to overcome. We found that DDS law enforcement lacked the most basic policies and procedures. It lacked accountability, it lacked performance standards, it lacked proper equipment, and it was divided and in a continual state of turmoil. Evidence was not properly preserved and accounted for. Investigations were not conducted in a timely manner and forwarded to the local DA's office for review. Each center was operated as a fiefdom, isolated from headquarters with its own unique way of doing business. This led to inconsistent practices and the appearance of interference by senior management into the investigative function. Our audit contained a total of 28 specific recommendations. Some of the more important were: there was no viable substitute for the law enforcement division and that this responsibility should be retained. That DDS needed to create an executive management position, police chief, vested with responsibility and authority to manage the law enforcement division. It then needed to recruit and hire a highly qualified and experienced law enforcement professional. The law enforcement unit had to be reorganized to provide a clear chain of command and isolate the investigative function from any real or perceived interference. Policies and procedures had to be written. During our audit, there was a great deal of discussion between Mr. Duchesne and myself about the recommendation that DDS retain its investigative function. We never saw this as the ideal solution to the problem. We realized that our recommendations were dependent on the department making substantive changes in its policies and procedures, in its organizational structure, and most importantly, in its willingness to exercise necessary leadership and management control. Did the department take the necessary corrective actions? Many of the recommendations we made in our 2002 report to the Attorney General were never implemented. It took 6 years to complete the first ever written policy on investigating abuse, and as far as I know, the evidence policy is still not written. CHP officers filled the role of chief until 2007. The chiefs who followed included a labor mediator with no law enforcement experience, a security person who was indicted for allegation of frauds and fired from his post, and a veteran firefighter with no law enforcement experience. In 2006, the AG's Civil Rights Division issued a scathing report of DDS and its investigative function. The department has a long history of being unable or unwilling to effectively respond to, investigate, and prosecute allegations of criminal acts against its patients. Now is not the time to conduct yet another audit, nor is it the time to hire yet another consultant. What next? With the benefit of more than 10 years of hindsight, our original recommendation that DDS retain its investigative function was wrong. If we had it to do over again, our recommendation, based on what we now know, would be the investigations function of the Department of Developmental Services should be taken away. The answer to what you do with it next will not be cheap. It will not be easy, it will not be quick, and it will not be without risk. Any model for conducting investigations should include the following at a minimum: provide overall coordination and control on a statewide basis. This could be accomplished by an independent agency such as the Attorney General or the Office of Inspector General. I've heard some comments earlier about possible models. I haven't had an opportunity to look at that. I understand it's a fairly new thing that's just come to your attention, and I really can't comment on that. You have to use experienced, highly skilled investigators, either employed by local law enforcement agencies, those retired from law enforcement, or perhaps some of the people who exist within the department now. You have to train investigators to deal with emotionally vulnerable and intellectually limited patients. You have to write procedures that require developmental center staff to immediately notify investigators of suspected abuse and all death cases. Train developmental center personnel on these procedures and strictly enforce them through disciplinary proceedings and criminal prosecutions as necessary. Reconsider the ban on video recording equipment inside developmental centers. Most of these cases lack any real evidentiary proof to be able to prosecute cases. It's time to consider the safety of clients residing at the developmental centers as being more important than some privacy concerns. Any solution you choose will take a tough-minded approach to rectify the mistakes that have pervaded the organization for so long. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Senator Wright.
A couple of things. I mean, you raise a question that's actually more fundamental than changing the investigative process, which is whether or not we should maintain the agency at all.
Yes, sir.
I mean, I'm just saying, I mean, if you look at the dwindling population that we're serving, and if you take into account the abuses that you're describing, then it doesn't appear that we're doing a particularly good job at this level of business. I mean, I'm old enough to have known Mr. Lanterman when he served here and created much of what we have in terms of community programs for some development disabled people, and it might be that might be an option. I mean, you're describing a totally dysfunctional system in one part. Given the costs that we have in this system, the investigative part is the portion that you deal with. But from what you've seen, all of you, should we even be in this business? When I say the business of housing this class of patient.
Senator Wright, I think in terms of the investigation portions of it, the specialized training that our officers receive, just to follow up on what you said, makes them very critical. Their independence from the administration is the problem where we see that seems to be bringing this to our attention. I know we've had issues at other agencies like the Department of Mental Health, which is now kind of dissolving and turning into a new department, the Department of State Hospitals. There has been talk from, I guess, some union folks that believe that consolidating the two, the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Developmental Services, into the Department of State Hospitals would be appropriate. I'm not certain that that's the case. I don't necessarily believe destroying the Department of Developmental Services is the right way to go in terms of being involved in this sort of clientele and services, because I definitely believe that many of our consumers have a need that the state can only provide, and I certainly believe that this situation in terms of the law enforcement aspect really is not far from being a good situation. It needs good leadership and it needs independence. Now, I'm not saying take OPS and give it to DOJ, but there's certainly a need to be independent from the administration, because you can't have licensing looking over law enforcement, because there's no administrator that is required to have law enforcement training.
See, the challenge here.
Sure.
The challenge for me is, as I'm listening to you describe it, is a similar thing that I mentioned earlier to the other panel. You show up when you're called, but between the time the incident took place and the time that you get called, you don't know how much time has elapsed, and you don't know what evidence may have been destroyed. You don't know what precautions may have been taken if there's no video evidence. So by the time you get there, you may walk into a totally sanitized environment. I mean, the investigator, and I forgot your name, sir, but
James Klein, sir.
Mr. Klein and Mr. Pizza, you described two different things. Mr. Klein was describing the training as being sufficient. You were describing the training as being insufficient. I mean, just as the two of us were sitting here, we have investigators that have asked for additional training.
It's over and above what they're they want to better themselves, but have been turned down.
Okay, Senator Wright, if I could comment on your question, I think you might have had part of that directed at me, and if you didn't, I apologize.
Could have. We beat up on everybody.
I think that one of the questions was, is a fundamental change necessary?
Yes.
And sitting here today, I feel like it's 10 years ago. Nothing has changed. And that's the problem I have, is that we're talking about the need to write policies and procedures that should have been written 10 years ago when we issued the report from the Attorney General's office. And how many more times are we going to meet and talk about the need to make fundamental reform? At some point, you have to assume that it doesn't work and we need to do something differently. And I think that's what I've recommended today, is that we take a look and come up with something that's fundamentally different than what we're doing now. We can't discard the experience of some of these investigators. Mr. Duchesne and I had long discussions on the phone over the last few days. He lives in Southern California and couldn't be here. And the dilemma that local cops are not trained adequately in these procedures. So we have to somehow blend the two and give this organization the independence and the leadership necessary to get the job done. As a police chief, I was a chief of police for over 25 years. And if my organization had failed the way this one had, I would have been fired.
The challenge becomes, though, and I agree with you, Mr. Sims, but if we're looking at a dwindling patient population, and we're looking at an ever-increasing budget allocation, so it's kind of like the patient load is doing this, and the amount of dollars going out is doing this. Now, in South LA, where I live, we would argue something in the milk ain't white. And so if we're getting more cost for fewer patients, and then the safety of the patients that we have is in jeopardy, then we need to evaluate the whole thing. I mean, in terms of just in terms of what it should be, because maybe again we might need to look at just how we provide the service and whether or not the method in which we're providing the service is part of the problem. I think at a minimum, Madam Chair, we would have to conclude that this has got to be one of the only agencies in the world where the law enforcement provision is governed by the people who have the most to lose in the structure. I mean, on its face, again, I was being facetious, but I mean, you can't have the fox watching the hen house. So I mean, at a minimum, I think we have to fix that. I think, as I'm looking, Miss
it is about
Morrison,
resources.
and Miss Morrison was describing, if I understood you correctly, I forgot whether or not it was on page 2 or page 13, but that the investigations that you conducted, I'm not sure what level of authority that you have given the state and federal authority, but you indicated that of those investigations that you conducted, that most of them were found to be unsubstantiated.
What I said was that they did not show that abuse and neglect was a contributing cause.
Okay.
I want to respond to what you suggested about sort of throwing out the whole system, and hopefully my testimony spoke to the fact that the system is broken everywhere. People with disabilities are abused everywhere at much higher rates than people without disabilities. And the response that they get in the developmental centers from the Office of Protective Services is better than they would get if they were living in the community. Officers in the community do not like going in institutions, be it a large developmental center or a small 6-bed group home or a 99-bed nursing home. They do not have the skills to interview people with disabilities.
You said that you don't have data from the community, right?
That's correct. There is no data.
Then how do you make that statement?
Based on the extensive studies that have been done by experts in the field.
But if they ain't got no data either, then how do they make the statement?
Well, they're basing it on surveys they're doing of people with disabilities. So if you're asking me what the rate of abuse and crime against Californians is, I will tell you there is no firm data because we don't collect the data. What happens is experts go out and they interview 600 people with developmental disabilities and they ask them questions about rates of victimization. The best we have is studies that have been done recently by the Federal Office of Justice, which also shows that people with disabilities are victimized at much higher rates than people without disabilities, and they got that information by door-to-door surveys they did during the census. So we know that they are victimized at higher rates, but we do not track victims through the system.
I don't mean to.
It's okay.
Okay.
One more.
But if your investigations concluded that in many instances the people reporting, the victims, were not necessarily reliable witnesses, Now, I mean, you said
I didn't say that they weren't reliable. I said many of the...
You said that, I forget which page, but I think the comment specifically was that when you interviewed the victim, that what you found was that they recanted, and, I mean, if you bothered to put it into the testimony, I assume that you put it in there because it was representative of something, or you weren't relating to a specific case as a representative of the whole thing, right? I mean, you put it in your testimony. I didn't put it in mine.
What we looked at was the reporting done and the investigations done by the Office of Protective Services. So we did not go and interview any victims. We did not conduct primary investigations. What we did is look at the quality and thoroughness and timeliness of the investigations that were done. And in fact, you're correct. Certainly in all of the deaths, the victims couldn't be interviewed.
I mean, again, I am very familiar with my group homes that house developmentally disabled patients. I can tell you from firsthand knowledge, having been to at least 30 of them, that the care that they receive in homes is better than they would receive in institutions. Now, I've been to institutions and I've been to homes. The homes are better. Typically, you're talking about a family arrangement, and it might be 3 to 6 persons. Again, these are not people I'm talking about that have severe medical issues, but they're people who have developmental disabilities. In Los Angeles, we have an agency called the Willing Workers, where a number of disabled or developmentally disabled people go every day. They go on a bus. They perform activities in a day environment. They go back and forth. I mean, there is a huge network in Los Angeles that functions very well, and the people who I see tend to, again, this is not scientific, but in the 30-plus homes that I've seen over the better part of 40 years, they fare a whole lot better than the people do in institutions.
Well, if I could just respond to that, I think you're talking about perhaps quality of care issues, and I can't speak to that. I can talk about the incidence of abuse, and what I can tell you is abuse happens everywhere. Criminal victimization happens everywhere.
Well,
it happens in small group homes,
right.
It happens in day programs, it happens on paratransit buses, it happens in large institutions, it happens everywhere. So while I certainly appreciate and respect your opinion about going into 30 homes, my experience in the 10 years that I've been, or more, that I've been looking at abuse of people with disabilities is that it happens everywhere, and the response that you get from local law enforcement to crimes and victimization in the community, there are challenges there. Those officers don't have the training to interview people with disabilities, and they are reluctant to initiate some of those investigations.
Let me reverse the earlier discussion then. So would you then say we should repeal the Landerman Act and close all the group homes and put people back in institutions?
I think that you're mixing apples and oranges.
I asked you a yes or no question.
And I will answer it. What we're talking about is abuse of people in the developmental centers. The Landerman Act covers much more than that. Certainly my organization is supportive of moving people out of institutions and into small community homes. Institutional living might not be as rich and as fulfilling as living in community homes. But the Landerman Act covers much, much more than the scope of what we're talking about here today, which is rates of victimization and response to that. And I think that to talk about throwing out the entire Landerman Act is beyond the scope of what this hearing is about.
Okay. Well, I posed it only because again, I happen to be a fan of the Landerman Act. Mm-hmm. And when I thought I understood you to say that you thought that the institutions perform better than homes, then that would suggest that you'd get rid of it. Okay, so we agree that there is a place for the community. Then the question becomes, is there a place for the community in this portion of the patient population, given that we've got dysfunctionality in the law enforcement, in the reporting, and again, it's not clear because we don't have good data, and given that the administration is in the pipeline of the reporting process, then that means that if the administration has the ability to determine when you get to file the case, then that means that we don't know what the actual incidence of abuse is, because if it were the administration's choice, your word, not mine, they're interested in protecting their license. So if the license is in jeopardy, therefore, the license would preempt the patient, and so the patient would be left out. I'm extrapolating on where you were going.
Absolutely.
So that means that the reliability then of the data isn't there, because the data is corrupted by the person who's trying to protect his or her license.
Absolutely, Senator Wright. You're right on target with that.
I'm just taking what...
You're absolutely right on target with that.
Okay.
Hang on. Senator
Okay, I'm
Emerson,
sorry.
do you remember what it was?
I've been a little confused. We've had Colonel Sanders and the Fox here with chickens. I want to ask a question of Mr. Sims. In 2002, were you with the Attorney General's office at that point?
Senator, in 2000, I was a happily retired taxpaying member of California Society. The AG's office asked me if I'd like to work on an hourly rate as a very lowly paid consultant for them.
But we did get taxes from you.
Yes, sir.
For that
Yeah,
time,
and I'm fixing those right now at home. Thank you.
No. So in 2002, the Attorney General's office, acting upon a subcommittee of request in the Senate to prepare a report within developmental centers. Is that correct? So it was 10 years ago.
Yes, sir. It goes back to actually fall of 2000. Senator Wesley Chesbrough was the person who initiated this, along with a state assembly person, and I can't remember his name.
Yes, that's okay. We turned people through here pretty quickly. But in 2002, it was released.
Right.
The report was released in March 2002,
Yeah.
correct.
And so who was that directed to?
We directed the report to the Attorney General, but we also met with senior staff at DDS and gave them copies of the report and discussed it at length, including the director and the deputy director at the time.
And so it did not come back to the legislature to follow up on that report.
To my knowledge, it did not.
So then that report fell on deaf ears, to your knowledge.
I can't really comment on that, but I can just tell you it doesn't seem like a lot of the important things that we recommended have been changed.
There were 27 recommendations. So have you seen any of them enacted?
I can't speak to that. I can only tell you what I've seen in the news media about the deficiencies that still exist, and many of those are covered in the recommendations that we made.
Senator, let me come to bat for the department here in certain circumstances. The chain of command that was represented in the report was implemented. Unfortunately, some of the things that you also addressed in the report still present itself today, like interference on behalf of the administration into investigations.
Well, let me stop you right there. Can you provide me with those instances where those were where there was interference in an investigation?
I will do so privately. I don't want to get any of my investigators in trouble.
I'm just asking if you can give me the number. I don't care about the investigations. But,
in terms of how many,
right?
I can get that to you at the end of this hearing. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, to kind of follow up with what Senator Wright was saying, he was talking about Governor Schwarzenegger approach of blow up the boxes. We don't believe that that's necessary. I think you're very close to having a very sophisticated structure, and the way Mr. Sims, I guess, addressed in the 2002 report, the structure should work, is having that chain of command and not having interference from people who have an outside interest in protecting licensing. Protecting justice, safety, and the clientele should be the primary concern overall. And I think we're very close to having that happen. You need the right people in leadership, and you need a leadership role that is independent.
I think if I wasn't here in 2002, but it appears to me that this report was directed towards developmental centers, so it has nothing to do with licensing of community-based programs or anything. I want to know where that report went and I'm concerned. I've been in the legislature now 8 years, and I see us asking for all sorts of reports, but I never see any of them getting back to the committees where they they were directed from, so that we can see those reports. I want to know where this report went.
We received a copy of the report, and we brought it to the attention of the Department of Developmental Services and asked, what have you done to implement these recommendations? And we were continually pushed off in terms of addressing those concerns. Some of their concerns, like the structure of OPS, have been implemented, and we think that is key. We think that's the most important thing that they could do, is implement the structure that they have. Now they need to put the right people in place.
Okay, thank you.
It's my understanding that there was no follow-up hearings related to that. Advocates in the community have been asking the legislature to hold a hearing to get a status update on implementation of those recommendations, and it's my understanding that hearing has not happened.
This is as close as it's come.
Right. And I think one of the bigger picture items here is, if there's another audit conducted, and I think Mr. Sims is right, there doesn't need to be another audit conducted. You have probably the best. Yeah, you have the best law enforcement agency in the entire state conducting an audit in 2002 that came up with the recommendations that will work. The DOJ audit is sufficient.
Other than an audit of where the hell all these reports go, I would like to see that. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Sims, how large of an investigative unit would be needed, and where would you house it?
I really can't answer how large the investigative unit should be. I know that the department has gotten smaller. It's got fewer sites. I think you've got a couple of real important issues here. One is geographically, it's a very diverse system. So you need to have investigators located geographically in order to respond in a very timely fashion. You can't centrally house everybody in Sacramento and expect it to work. If you use the Department of Corrections, for example, they have an internal affairs unit, investigative unit, that's housed throughout the state in order to respond to their facilities. So something along that model is absolutely necessary. How many investigators? A committee could work on those sorts of details and come back with some good answers.
I know, and so there's an authorized 94 folks and 20.
You have 93 budgeted positions for peace officers, and these are the actual officers,
right.
And you have 60 of them filled. You have 36 investigators authorized and 17 of them filled. These are at each individual facility. So you have investigators and peace officers at the facilities. You don't have to call out and have people respond. They're there all the time, 24/7.
Right. Senator Emerson?
Well, I have a question. I mean, with the declining population and what do we have? How many developmental centers we have?
5.
5.
One's closing, on the process of being
right.
closed.
It seems that number you're telling me is excessive for that small of a number of developmental centers at this point.
Well, sorry, Senator. Considering Porterville Developmental Center is a forensic facility, there is a fence, there is a criminal population there. You need at least 40 officers at that facility alone. So then you take the other 4 facilities, and now you're left with 20. So essentially, you're splitting up 5 officers at each facility, and given the 3 shifts that they have to guard 24/7, I think it's probably challenge. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
If we were taking the centers that we have now, we've got some 1,600. 1,800. And we had to rate the safety of what the service that we're providing. So if we were trying to rate the quality, and in this case we won't rate the quality because that's not what you do, but if we were rating the safety of that service, what would it be? I mean,
I guess I don't understand the question, and again, it gets back.
A, B, C, D, or F. Rate the quality of the safety of the people, the 1,800 people that we have.
I think that the in terms of abuse and neglect and crimes, from the cases that we looked at, very few were indicative of abuse, neglect, or crime.
Okay.
I don't know about quality of care. That's beyond the scope.
Right, I understand. I'm just on the portion that you deal with so that the safety of the population is good in your view.
Senator, if I may, I can tell you I've been in this facility, in a specific facility. I've worked at different facilities throughout Southern California. The 2 developmental centers and the one that I'm currently assigned to, Canyon Springs, which is a community facility, which is a smaller developmental center. In the 10 years that I've been there, I believe that the safety is a lot better in these facilities, even though the article claimed that there was